A major win for New York waterways. We first told you about the Billion Oyster Project a couple of weeks ago. Now it's getting nearly $1 million in funding.
More than 100 million oysters have been lowered into the gray water around New York City, dropped onto the harbor floor on purpose, by hand, one cage at a time. On paper, it sounds simple. Put the oysters back where they used to be and see what happens. But almost nobody expected what actually happened next. The people running the project thought they were rebuilding a single lost species. Instead, the harbor started doing things they never planned for, never promised, and at first could barely explain. And the strangest part did not show up until they pulled the cages back out of the water. The oyster capital.
If we take better care of the harbor, we can have one of the biggest cities in the world existing with a sustainable relationship with the ecosystem around it. And how cool would that be?
Wind. The clock back a few hundred years, and the water around New York looked nothing like it does today. The harbor held oyster reefs covering roughly 220,000 acres, an underwater landscape bigger than the city that would one day forget it. Some accounts describe this single estuary as holding a remarkable share of all the oysters on the planet. Here's the part nobody talks about. These oysters were not a luxury. They were everyday food, cheap and everywhere, eaten by the rich and the poor alike, sold by the basket on street corners. The discarded shells were burned for lime and used to surface roads. An entire young city was quietly built on top of them. And the oysters were doing work the city barely noticed. Each one cleaned the water as it fed. Their reefs built shelter for fish and crabs, and they took the punch out of waves long before those waves ever reached the shore. Then, it all disappeared, and almost nobody alive today remembers it was ever there. How they vanished.
There are more oysters consumed, produced, and shipped out of New York Harbor and New York City than anywhere else in the world. But by the early 1800s, we'd eaten them all.
So how does an entire ecosystem this size simply vanish, slowly, and by human hands? As New York exploded into one of the largest cities on Earth, the harbor paid for it. Oysters were dredged up faster than the reefs could ever rebuild. Factories and packed neighborhoods poured raw sewage straight into the water. The seafloor was torn open to make room for shipping lanes. Think about what that does to a creature that needs clean, settled ground just to grow. Year by year, the harbor turned hostile to the very thing that had defined it. By 1927, the last of the region's major commercial oyster beds were shut down. Many of them closed because the polluted water had made the oysters dangerous to eat. One of the most important ecosystems in North America was gone. For the better part of a century, nobody seriously believed it could ever come back. Until 2014, when a small group decided to try anyway. 1 billion oysters. In 2014, a group of restoration scientists and educators launched something with a name that sounded almost like a dare, the Billion Oyster Project. The goal was right there in the name. Put 1 billion oysters back into New York Harbor with a long-term target set around the year 2035. And get this, they were not planning to do it in some quiet, sheltered cove. They wanted to grow 1 billion living things in one of the busiest, dirtiest, most crowded harbors on the planet, ringed by millions of people and crossed all day by ship traffic. It sounded impossible. 1 billion is a number you cannot really hold in your head, and this harbor had spent 100 years as a dumping ground. So, where do you even start? If you are the kind of person who roots for a beaten-down place getting one more shot, take a second to subscribe before we go on. It is a small thing, and it helps stories like this one reach the people who would love them, because the way this team chose to begin was something almost nobody expected. Shells from restaurants. The answer was sitting in the trash behind seafood restaurants. Here is the thing about baby oysters, called spat. They cannot just drift in open water and hope for the best. They need something hard to grab onto, a solid surface where they can lock down and start to grow. And the single best surface for a young oyster turns out to be the shell of an old one. So the project went straight to the one place in the city with a bottomless supply of empty shells. Restaurants. Dozens of them now set their shells aside instead of tossing them out. Those shells get gathered up and trucked to a lot near the water, where they sit in great pale heaps, bleaching in the sun and rain for months, until salt and weather have scoured them clean. Only then are they seeded with spat and lowered back into the harbor. Think about that loop for a second. Last night's dinner becomes the foundation of a brand new reef. Millions of pounds of shells that were headed for a landfill go back into the harbor they came from instead. It is the cleanest kind of recycling there is, a city quietly feeding its own harbor back to itself. But collecting shells was only half of it. Someone still had to raise the oysters, and the project found its workforce in the strangest place of all: a city of students. It did not start in a corporate lab. The Billion Oyster Project grew out of the New York Harbor School, a public high school sitting right on Governor's Island. Picture a teenager in a classroom on Governor's Island that smells of salt water, sleeves shoved up, bent over a tank and counting oysters no bigger than a fingernail. When the new count comes back higher than last month, you can see it land on her face. That is not a field trip. That is the actual work. Students across dozens of city schools raise spat, haul, and bolt together the heavy cages that hold them, and head back out onto the water in all weather to measure growth, test conditions, and log every living thing they find. Out past the seawall, a restoration crew from the project leans over the side of a workboat, easing a fresh structure down toward the harbor floor, marking the coordinates, trusting that months from now, there will be something down there worth coming back for. Here is the part that gets me. The kids who will inherit this harbor are the ones out there rebuilding it, by hand, one shell at a time. For years, the story stayed exactly that simple. People put oysters in. People checked on them. People hoped. And then the harbor started doing something nobody had told it to do. What came back? Remember that cage from the very start, the one hauled up off Governor's Island? This is what was clinging to it. A diver hangs in the green murk a few feet above the reef, breath rasping in the regulator, and runs a gloved hand over a surface that should have been bare. It is not bare. It is rough and alive under the fingers, layered with growth, busy with things that move. Not just oysters, life. As the new reefs took hold, divers and students kept pulling up structures crowded with creatures nobody had placed there. A blackfish noses out of a crevice. A blue crab backs into an empty shell. Small fish dart through the gaps, and shrimp and worms and whole tiny communities set up home inside the reef. Here is why that happens. An oyster reef is not a pile of shellfish. It is a rugged, three-dimensional city full of hiding places, and that structure is exactly what marine life needs to feed, to hide, and to breed. Build the reef, and the neighborhood moves in on its own. And get this, none of those animals were ever part of the plan. The project set out to grow oysters. What it actually grew was a home. And once the home was there, everything else came looking for it. Then there was the water itself. A single adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a single day. Multiply that across a living reef, and the math starts to matter fast. And there was one more thing the oysters were doing, the part almost nobody connects to a shellfish at all. A living seawall. Oyster reefs can protect the shoreline. A dense reef absorbs and breaks up the energy of incoming waves before they ever hit the land. Picture a wave rolling in and meeting a wall of rough, knobbed shell instead of open water. The reef scatters its force, and whatever reaches the shore behind it arrives gentler. In plain terms, a living reef can act like a soft seawall. And get this, in a city ringed by ocean, that is anything but a small thing. New York learned that lesson the hard way. When Hurricane Sandy slammed into the city in 2012, storm surge flooded entire neighborhoods and caused billions of dollars in damage. Cars drifted down avenues. Salt water poured into subway tunnels and basements all along the waterfront. A line of oyster reefs would not have stopped a storm that size. Nothing natural could. But reefs are exactly the kind of buffer that can drain some of the punch from rising water before it reaches the street. So this stopped being a feel-good science project and turned into something far more serious. A piece of how a coastal city might one day defend itself, which raises the obvious question. After a decade of this, how many oysters are actually down there now? The numbers. The answer is staggering. The project has put more than 100 million oysters back into New York Harbor. Recent figures push that total past 140 million. To build the reefs holding them, crews have recycled millions of pounds of restaurant shells, planted across restoration sites that stretch from the water around Governor's Island out to reefs tucked along the edges of the 5 boroughs. And here is what keeps the whole thing honest. Nobody is dropping oysters in the water and walking away. On a cold morning, a diver breaks the surface beside the boat, peels off a glove, and reads numbers off a slate while someone scribbles them into a notebook, one sight at a time. Divers and students return to the reefs over and over, checking how many survived, measuring how fast they grow, counting the life moving in around them. This is not a hope. It is something you can actually measure year after year. The billion oyster goal is still a long way off, and the team will tell you that themselves. But then, in 2024, something turned up that nobody on the project had planned for at all. Nature joins in. For a decade, every oyster in this story got there because a human put it there, gathered the shell, seeded the spat, lowered the cage. Then, in 2024, surveys started finding oysters in places nobody had planted them. Out in the shallows off Queens, a surveyor crouches in the muck, turns over a hard surface, and there it is. A wild oyster nobody seeded, in water that had no business growing one. Researchers documented hundreds of them, growing on their own, where oysters had been rare or absent for generations. Now, careful scientists are not getting carried away, and neither should we. It is early, and one survey is not a recovery, but think about what it hints at. For a project built on the belief that this harbor could no longer grow its own oysters, finding wild ones doing it anyway is a quietly enormous thing. It is the difference between pushing a stalled car and feeling the engine finally catch. The water may have shifted just enough for life to take hold on its own again. The crew might no longer be the only thing rebuilding these reefs, and what that points to is far bigger than oysters. The real surprise. So go back to that diver off Governor's Island, pulling up a cage heavy with life nobody placed there. That was the surprise. Not that millions of oysters could survive in New York Harbor. The surprise was everything that arrived with them. Fish moved back in. Reefs grew where there had been bare, dead floor. Shorelines picked up a layer of natural armor. Birds followed the fish, and divers who once drifted over silent, silty bottom now glide over something textured and crowded. One of the most beaten up waterways on the planet started slowly to turn a corner. Now, a reality check, because this story earns its honesty. The water is cleaner than it was, but it is not clean. You still should not eat an oyster pulled from this harbor. The reefs are growing, but they are nowhere near what they once were. What has changed is the direction. For the first time in a century, the line is pointing up. If this is the kind of story you want more of, do 2 quick things for me. Subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. And then tell me down in the comments, what broken down place near you do you think deserves a second chance like this one? I read every answer.